Welcome back to God's Story, Our Mission, Week 9. Today we are going to explore biblical wisdom for God's wise and holy mission. When we come to the wisdom books of the Old Testament, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, we come to a different set of biblical material that takes us out of the historical and story-driven context of the Old Testament. And yet this has a special place in the biblical material. As we mentioned all the way back in Lesson 1, God's plan is for all creation. Yahweh is the creator of the entire cosmos and dwells and desires to dwell in his cosmos as a temple. That's what we saw in Genesis 1 and 2, and that's what we saw as God completes his mission in the last chapters of the Bible in Revelation. So as we come to understand God's work within creation, we see that an important part of the biblical material gets us to think about God's creation, to ponder how God has set up life in the world. As God's holy people, we are called to understand this creational context and creational living in the context, in the framework of our relationship with Yahweh. That is why the wisdom books are so clear that true wisdom begins with the fear of Yahweh, a true awe-filled recognition of our life before Yahweh. But because there is this wider context, indeed creation as the context for how we investigate life in relationship with Yahweh, this allows us to be in conversation with other cultures and other peoples. Wisdom literature in the ancient world pervaded all of the ancient Near East. Egypt had its wisdom literature, Assyria had its wisdom literature, Babylon had its wisdom literature. We can think of other ancient cultures such as China and India that pervade wise sages or are pervaded with wise sages and wisdom material. We see that this part of God's biblical material for his people allows us to be that bridge-building community. As we reflect upon the world around us in the context of our relationship with God, we are able to be in conversation with other cultures and people groups. And that's what makes this wisdom material perfect and ideal for our missional outreach and missional living as God's people. The book of Proverbs itself even collects wisdom sayings and wisdom material that is found outside of the biblical narrative. Indeed, the book of Proverbs itself shows how we can be bridge builders by how it incorporates wisdom from other cultures, but now sets in the context of Yahweh, in our relationship with Yahweh. We might even see in the New Testament, Acts chapter 17, as Paul is speaking to the Athenian philosophers on Mars Hill in Athens, how he uses a Stoic poem to talk about the God of Israel, and yet he puts it within the framework of the story of God's people in the Bible. We can be these bridge builders by how we think through the world. So that brings us to what is the nature of wisdom? What are we called to do and to be as people who care about wisdom? Surely in our culture today, there is information aplenty. It's an embarrassment of riches as we have at our fingertips information unprecedented in the history of human culture and civilization. With a click of the button on an iPhone, we have more information at our disposal than at any other time in history. And yet, just having knowledge and information doesn't mean that we are wise people. Information is not the same thing as wisdom. As we come to the book of Proverbs in the biblical wisdom literature, we see that wisdom is much more than just being smart or having a high IQ or knowing lots of facts. It's actually sanctified common sense. It is the art of living and thinking through life well in our relationship with God. How do we practically think about life as God has given us a framework through creation in his relationship with us? That's what the book of Proverbs, and indeed the entire corpus of the wisdom literature, is about. So as we come to the biblical wisdom literature, we want to ask ourselves, what does it look like? As we come to the book of Proverbs, we want to ask, what is a proverb? Well, there are proverbs that appear in every culture throughout the world. It might be in vogue to post an African proverb or an Arabic proverb or a Chinese proverb on one's Facebook profile, or to have a poster with a proverb as an inspirational message. We may even have heard our grandparents use proverbs and wisdom-type messages. As we think of phrases such as out of sight, out of mind, or absence makes the heart grow fonder. These are proverbs, bits of wisdom that are meant to elucidate how we view the realities of life. They are pithy, usually poetic sayings that help us to engage in the world around us. But just like those two English proverbs, out of sight, out of mind, and absence makes the heart grow fonder, we realize that there has to be a particular context in which we use them, because jammed together, we see that they are actually contradictory. But proverbs are not meant to be used in a vacuum. They are meant to be used in particular contexts that help us think through life in particular circumstances. Not every proverb will work for every circumstance of life, but that's not the point. It's not to be a dogmatic assertion that is able to be used in a vacuum. It is meant to be applied to how life works in the concrete with particular circumstances and contexts. But how does a Hebrew proverb work? The Hebrew word for proverb, mashal, literally means to compare. Proverbs in Hebrew are meant to jam two things together to make us consider how life works, how they are either like something or unlike something. For instance, let us look at Proverbs 16, verse 24. Gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. The terms honeycomb and words, gracious words, are jammed together and compared and contrasted so that we begin to ascertain how in life words can be sweet and life-giving and nourishing in our relationships. But that's not just the end of it. As we begin to think through this pithy saying, this mashal, we are not meant to end the conversation there, but it is a beginning doorway to get us to think about how words function in our relationship, how God has designed our created relationships to work, and how words are a major part of that. We might also think about the proverb in Proverb 12, verse 1. Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid. That's the ESV translation. This is a pithy saying that tries to get us to think about how knowledge and discipline work together. And the lack of discipline creates space for ignorance to thrive instead of true wisdom and knowledge. But again, just having this little nugget of a phrase, this pithy saying, is not meant to be used in the abstract. It is meant to invite us to engage in particular circumstances in life. And that's what the book of Proverbs really tries to get us to do. As we come back to the beginning of the book of Proverbs, as we look for the greater framework, we can begin to think about how the book of Proverbs helps us to become wise for God's mission, as it gets us to learn how to build bridge by engaging in the world around us, to think through life, and to be able to share this wisdom. The first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs is admittedly a little different than the remaining 2/3 of the book. instead of these short, pithy, terse sayings from which the book of Proverbs actually derives its name, these mashals, the first 9 chapters is characterized by a longer set of poems. It's a prologue to the remaining 2/3 of the book. But it's meant to exhort its readers to live a life of wisdom, to engage in the world that Yahweh has created so that we can build bridges with other cultures and peoples, and to share the wisdom that comes from exploring and discerning the framework of life as Yahweh has created it. For instance, we have in Proverbs 1, verses 2 through 7, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand the words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance, to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. For the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. This prologue to the prologue, we might say, helps to set up what wisdom is and who are the major types of readers and those who engage with wisdom material. First, this prologue sets up what true biblical wisdom is. It's to know prudence. It's to shrewdly learn how to engage in the practical application of life. It is to have an understanding and a discernment of life. But it's also moral. That the way that we live life and the way that God has designed life is to be righteous, justice-filled, and to have equity. That knowledge and true wisdom is not morally neutral. That's why the wicked person, even the one with a high IQ, can never truly be wise as the Bible talks about it. The wicked and the foolish are those who are not those who receive that wise, righteous instruction from Yahweh or from those who pass on this wisdom. But this prologue also sets up some of the major types of characters, we might say, the types of people that engage with wisdom. First, there is the wise one. The one who is truly wise is the one that receives that wisdom from others. In the book of Proverbs, it is a father speaking to his son. So we see that wisdom, true wisdom, is something that is learned through relationship building. It's learned through discipling. Some people say that experience is the best teacher of wisdom, but the book of Proverbs has a different perspective. It's not just experience, but it is actually something that is handed down through teaching, through instruction, as we learn to look at those who are wiser than us, learning to imitate their mode of life and to actually learn from them. Wise people are those who engage in a lifelong process of discipleship, of learning at the feet of those who are wiser. Ultimately, the one who gives wisdom is Yahweh. To be wise is to put ourselves at the feet of God. A wise person isn't perfect in their knowledge, but it is one who always pursues this. In the book of Proverbs, there's another type of character, the simple. The simple one are those that are in a middle position between wisdom and foolishness. They have not yet attained the habits of life to learn wisdom, to put themselves under the feet of those who can give this instruction. But neither have they completely turned away from learning this. They're in that middle ground. We might say that as readers of Proverbs, we can see ourselves vulnerable in a potential place of being this simple person. What will we choose? Will we learn wisdom? Will we engage in this lifelong pursuit? Will we put ourselves in a position to discern the way that God has set up life? Or will we turn away? And that brings us to the foolish. The foolish one is someone who might have high intelligence, a high IQ, but who is wise in their own eyes. Those who turn away from Yahweh and turn away from the sages who teach this framework of wise living in the context of our relationship with God. who don't really engage in the life that God has established by his creation. Those are the three characters, we might say, human types of readers of wisdom. But there also is another character, or another set of characters in the prologue of the book of Proverbs that we want to pay attention to. There is Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. Two personifications in the book of Proverbs that are poetically given a character of their own. Wisdom itself is characterized in Proverbs as a worksmith alongside Yahweh. Indeed, it is a poetic way of showing how God creates this world with knowledge and understanding that God is not capricious and arbitrary with how he has set up the world, but he uses wisdom, he uses discernment. In the New Testament, in the early church, people saw Jesus as the one who was with Yahweh at the beginning, as the second person of the Trinity, as the Word and reason of God. Jesus is that wisdom by which God establishes all things. In the book of Proverbs, the point is certainly made that Yahweh himself is present by wisdom, that when God interacts with the world, it is a wise interaction, and therefore that framework of how God has created the world is a wise framework. But there's also the Lady Folly, the foil of Lady Wisdom in the book of Proverbs. It's the temptress who tries to get people to become foolish, tempting them to live in adulterous lifestyles, to fall away from Yahweh himself. These are the major characters of the book of Proverbs. And so to be readers of the book of Proverbs, to engage and to learn wisdom for a wise mission in the world, as we are called to be bridge builders and be in conversation with other peoples and people groups, we need to understand where our wisdom comes from and where our understanding comes from. Is it from a wise person that we imitate? Is it from God himself who uses wisdom in all things? Or do we become wise in our own eyes? Do we try to learn wisdom in a vacuum, divorced from God's community of faith by which we are called to engage together in our discernment of God's world? Again, the point of the book of Proverbs for our mission is to learn how to be those sanctified bridge builders, to engage in the world around us, and to get us thinking about God's world. We are not called to be isolated from other peoples. We are called to be bridge builders. And so part of that is to embody wisdom by learning to be people that think about the world around them, but from the perspective and the foundation that God has established this world as creator and redeemer and sanctifier. So what does sanctified living look like? How can we discern the world around us, even when we're not given specific guidance that we have to do this or have to do that? Even when we aren't given a play-by-play, we are still called to engage our minds in our lives with the world around us. Proverbs is the entry point. Proverbs is that invitation to investigate life as God has created it. It's not meant to be used in a vacuum. It's not meant to just be a playbook for our life, but it is meant to be an invitation to investigate, to begin comparing things in the world. How does wealth and blessing, how does that inform us how to live? How do we use our words? How do we think about our spousal relationships and even our sexuality? Those are all things that are dealt with in the book of Proverbs. We are called to be wise and loving with our words. We are called to use our wealth wisely. We are called to be people of action, not to be lazy, but to know how to accomplish tasks that we set out to do. But it's also better to be poverty-stricken and righteous than it is to be wealthy and wicked, Proverbs tells us. It also gives us the context for when we engage with people that are wise in their own eyes, foolish as the Proverbs talks about. When do we speak out? When do we keep silent? The book of Proverbs helps us to consider all of the different options and the different contexts to live wisely and to help us engage with other people around us. As God's people, we're not called just to learn a playbook. We are called to investigate and embody true wisdom as we interact with others around us. Hopefully, as we consider this, we understand the full biblical and Old Testament framework for our lives as God's people. With that, we end the Bible study portion of our lesson on God's story and our mission. Next week, our final week, we're going to try to wrap all of these things together. We're going to try to tie up some loose ends and think about where do we go as a congregation from here. Next time, God bless.